So I don't know about you, but a major problem I've always had with the Digitakt is remembering the workflow for loading samples, and to a lesser extent, managing sounds on the Digitone. It feels just complex enough that if I don't practice it, I forget entirely. So I thought I'd make a video about it, and maybe that would solidify a few of the concepts for me, and maybe for you too. And we'll also take a look at what the sound browser means. That was always a little bit confusing for me, but now I realize it's a very powerful feature that I will definitely be using a lot more in the future. So the Digitakt has several layers, and let's start at the highest level and drill down. The broadest layer is the project itself. We can find that in the settings menu. And we have all these other settings too, so pattern, song, and samples, which are all per project settings. And so the project contains all of these patterns, all of these samples, and that's how we manage things. Next, whether you use it or not, we have the song mode, which lets you organize patterns into a song, and then lets you say which tracks are muted. It's entirely optional, you don't have to use it. But on the current models, it's available on this first button. There we can enable the song mode and edit the settings. This leads us to patterns, and that's the layer we work with the most. A pattern is a collection of sample and MIDI tracks, and these are divided into banks, where you have 8 banks with 16 patterns each. We have the bank mode, where we can select each of the 8 banks, and then we have the pattern button, which allows us to pick up to 16 patterns in the bank that's currently selected. Inside of a pattern are tracks. For the Digitakt Mark I, we have 8 for samples, and we have 8 for MIDI. The Digitakt II, of course, has 16 tracks, but there you're free to assign samples and MIDI to any of those 16. The next logical step is saying that a track is a sample, but that would be wrong. You can parameter lock a particular sample or an entire sound, very much in the same way a tracker can have any instrument assigned to a particular step in its sequencer patterns. We'll get to trackers and how they relate to Elektron sequencers in another video. But here on these tracks, we can select any of the samples and cancel that out. Indeed, if we have a sequencer step selected, we can hold down a step and we can change the sample for that step. Pressing the step will show us which sample is in use. When working with the pattern, you can save the pattern as a whole to the project, but you can also save the kit. If we press the project button, we need to first save our project. And saving this project will store all of the patterns and all of the samples in use, of course. So now in the project menu, we can go to the pattern menu. And in here, we can rename the pattern, we can clear it, we can save it to the project, and reload. But when we go to save the project, here we can save the entire pattern, or we can save the track data separately, and we can save the sequence data separately. And in this way, they are stored independently. So basically, if you mess one of these up, you can easily restore it back to where you were when you last saved. Let's of course not forget the temporary pattern area, which can be accessed with function save pattern and function reload pattern. This lets us save and restore the pattern at will, and it's useful for making changes during performance and then restoring back to a safe place. So that leaves us with samples and sounds. How do we get samples into a project? Well, we press the settings button, and from here, we can scroll to the samples option. And here you will either see a list of all of the samples which are currently loaded, or by pressing left, we can view the plus drive, which is the internal storage, and selecting that will give us a file browser where we can access all the samples that we've loaded onto Elektron. And we can do that with the transfer app on your computer. We'll go over that in a future video. We're just going to focus on what's on the device right now. And so we can go into one of my transfer folders, for instance, and we can select samples by pressing yes, and this will select them. There's a little tick mark that shows up. And by pressing right, we can do batch operations where we can select all of the samples in the directory, or we can deselect all of them. I want these two. So from here, we can also delete them, and we can choose to move them around on the file system. But right now we're interested in loading them. So we'll just go to load to project, and we'll confirm that. And that'll bring those two samples into my project where they're stored in memory. Keep in mind that the Digitakt only has 64 megabytes of memory, so which equates to about 14.5 minutes worth of sample data. And that can be distributed along 127 samples in the project. So if we go back to the samples menu, press left and view RAM, this will show us everything that's loaded into RAM, including the two samples which I just loaded. To see how much RAM we're actually using right now, we can go back to the settings menu, and we can scroll down to system, and then we can go down to storage. And this will tell us how much free space is on the internal storage and how much space is available and in use in the RAM, including all the finer detail about how many samples are loaded and how much sample time is in use. Okay, so what if I've set up a track and I really like the sound that I've created, and I'd like to use it in other patterns or projects? I've carefully crafted the filter and LFO settings, they're just right. I don't want to have to do it again every time I want that particular sound. So that leads us to the concept of a sound. That's something I haven't really seen talked about much online on other videos, but it can be super useful, but it is a little complicated, and maybe that's why it isn't talked about that much. So looking at the front panel on the Digitakt, there is a sound browser label, and it's in yellow, so we can press Func and push the data knob. And you'll most likely see a message which looks like this: the plus drive has no sounds. Well, going back to our track, all of these settings make up a sound for this track, and we can save them and reload them. So we can do that by going into the settings menu, and we can go down to pattern, and in here we go to the import export menu. And this menu lets us, like it implies, import and export sounds. So we go to export sound from here. So this gives us a menu of 8 banks of 256 slots, so 2048 sound slots in total. We can select one of these, just go with the first one. And in here, we can give it a descriptive name. I've already have a name already entered here, so we'll just go with that. And then we can press save. And here we can give it some search tags. So we can, if we have a whole batch of different sounds, we can look them up later. So let's say it's a synth, it's a loop, it's one of mine, and maybe atmospheric. And then we just go to save. And now we have a sound stored in the sound browser. There we go, pigments. And in the sound browser, we can press function yes to preview the sound. As I said, we can press left and go to the pool, but that's weird. We have a sound already loaded and the sound's in the sound browser, but it's not in the pool. Didn't we just do that? Well, no. The sounds are stored on device in the plus drive, so inside the internal storage. So to load them into the pool, we can go into the settings menu. We can go into import export. And in here, we have other options. So we have import sound, and this lets us import the sound into one of the 8 sample tracks. So we can press yes, and then we can select one of our tracks to import this into. Now track 5 is the same as track 8. But the other option in here is manage sounds. It's a very similar menu, but here we can select the sounds just like we can when we're selecting a sample. And if we press right, we can also similarly do batch selection. And crucially, there's this copy to option. And if we select that, we can copy the sound into the one of the other banks on the device, or we can use sound pool. And if we select that, it's copied into the pool. And if we exit out and go back to the sound browser, you'll see, and we go over to view pool, you'll see the sound is now showing up in the sound pool. This would be a more dramatic effect if we had more sounds loaded, but there we have it. So what does the sound pool actually do? Well, it means that if I'm on a particular track, let's say the kick drum track, if I go into the sequence editor and select some tracks here, if I were to hold down one of the steps and turn the data knob, I can now pick a particular sound from the sound pool to be played on that track. And in here, I'm also free to parameter lock any of the other settings on this sound that I would otherwise be able to do. So I can make further customizations to the sound as I see fit for what makes sense on this track. But we're using the sample that we just loaded, so sample 15 in this case, and all the other settings for that sound are loaded up too. The great thing about this sound browser now that we have a sound loaded up in here, is that I can go into a new project. And with that loaded, we have all the default settings, but I can say select track 8, go to the function browser, and now I have that track loaded up in my new project. And that sounds on the Digitakt. I believe that the Digitakt Mark II also lets you save the entire set of tracks as a kit that you can pull up in a different pattern or project. But for the Mark I, we have sound browser and sounds. And that's basically it for sample and sound management. So if there are any other hidden details that I've missed, let me know in the comments. And indeed, a lot of this management can also be done in Overbridge and the Elektron Transfer app. But I think I've rambled on enough today that we can go over those extra details in a future video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.